Communism, from Latin communis, common, universal, is a far-left socio-political, philosophical, and economic ideology and current within the socialist movement whose goal is the establishment of a communist society, namely a socio-economic order centered around common ownership of the means of production, distribution, and exchange, allocating products to everyone in the society. It also involves the absence of social classes, money, and the state. Communists often seek a voluntary state of self-governance, but disagree on the means to this end. This reflects a distinction between a more libertarian approach of communization, revolutionary spontaneity, and workers' self-management, and a more vanguardist or communist party-driven approach through the development of a constitutional socialist state followed by Friedrich Engels' withering away of the state. Variants of communism have been developed throughout history, including anarcho-communism and Marxist schools of thought, among others. Communism includes a variety of schools of thought which broadly include Marxism, Leninism, and libertarian communism as well as the political ideologies grouped around both. All of these different ideologies share the analysis that the current order of society stems from capitalism, its economic system and mode of production, namely that in this system there are two major social classes, the relationship between these two classes is exploitative, and that this situation can only ultimately be resolved through a social revolution. The two classes are the proletariat, the working class, who make up the majority of the population within society and must work to survive, and the bourgeoisie, the capitalist class, a small minority who derives profit from employing the working class through private ownership of the means of production. According to this analysis, revolution would put the working class in power and in turn, establish common ownership of property, which is the primary element in the transformation of society towards a communist mode of production. In the 20th century, ostensibly communist governments espousing Marxism-Leninism and its variants came into power in parts of the world, first in the Soviet Union with the Russian Revolution of 1917, and then in portions of Eastern Europe, Asia, and a few other regions after World War II. Along with social democracy, communism became the dominant political tendency within the international socialist movement by the early 1920s. During most of the 20th century, around one-third of the world's population lived under communist governments. These governments were characterized by one-party rule and suppression of opposition and dissent. With the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, several communist governments repudiated or abolished communism altogether. Afterwards, only a small number of communist governments remained, namely China, Cuba, Laos and Vietnam. While the emergence of the Soviet Union as the world's first nominally communist state led to communism's widespread association with the Soviet economic model, several scholars posit that in practice, the model functioned as a form of state capitalism. Public memory of 20th-century communist states has been described as a battleground between the communist sympathetic political left and the anti-communist political right. Many authors have written about excess deaths under communist states and mortality rates, such as excess mortality in the Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin. Communism derives from the French communism, which developed out of the Latin roots communis and the suffix ismi. Semantically, communis can be translated to ever for the community, while ismi is a suffix that indicates the abstraction into a state, condition, action, or doctrine. Communism may be interpreted as the state of being ever for the community. This semantic constitution has led to numerous usages of the word in its evolution. Prior to becoming associated with its more modern conception of an economic and political organization, it was initially used in designating various social situations. Communism came to be primarily associated with Marxism, most specifically embodied in the Communist Manifesto, which proposed a particular type of communism. One of the first uses of the word in its modern sense is in a letter sent by Victor Dupe to Restif de la Bretonne around 1785, in which Dupe describes himself as an auteur communist, communist author, 56. In 1793, Restif first used communism to describe a social order based on egalitarianism and the common ownership of property. Restif would go on to use the term frequently in his writing and was the first to describe communism as a form of government. John Goodwin Barmby is credited with the first use of communism in English, around 1840. Since the 1840s, communism has usually been distinguished from socialism. The modern definition and usage of the latter would be settled by the 1860s, becoming predominant over alternative terms associationist, Fourierism, cooperative, and mutualist, which had previously been used as synonyms. Instead, communism fell out of use during this period. An early distinction between communism and socialism was that the latter aimed to only socialize production, whereas the former aimed to socialize both production and consumption, in the form of common access to final goods. This distinction can be observed in Marx's communism, where the distribution of products is based on the principle of to each according to his needs, in contrast to a socialist principle of to each according to his contribution. Socialism has been described as a philosophy seeking distributive justice, and communism as a subset of socialism that prefers economic equality as its form of distributive justice. By 1888, Marxists employed socialism in place of communism, which had come to be considered an old-fashioned synonym for the former. It was not until 1917, with the Bolshevik Revolution, that socialism came to refer to a distinct stage between capitalism and communism, introduced by Vladimir Lenin as a means to defend the Bolshevik seizure of power against traditional Marxist criticism that Russia's productive forces were not sufficiently developed for socialist revolution. A distinction between communist and socialist as descriptors of political ideologies arose in 1918 after the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party renamed itself to the All-Russian Communist Party, where communist came to specifically refer to socialists who supported the politics and theories of Bolshevism, Leninism, and later in the 1920s those of Marxism-Leninism, although communist parties continued to describe themselves as socialists dedicated to socialism. Both communism and socialism eventually accorded with the cultural attitude of adherents and opponents towards religion. In European Christendom, communism was believed to be the atheist way of life. In Protestant England, communism was too phonetically similar to the Roman Catholic communion rite, hence English atheists denoted themselves socialists. Friedrich Engels stated that in 1848, at the time when the Communist Manifesto was first published, socialism was respectable on the continent, while communism was not. The Owenites in England and the Fourierists in France were considered respectable socialists, while working-class movements that proclaimed the necessity of total social change denoted themselves communists. This latter branch of socialism produced the communist work of Étienne Cabet in France and Wilhelm Weitling in Germany. While liberal Democrats looked to the revolutions of 1848 as a democratic revolution which in the long run ensured liberty, equality, and fraternity, Marxists denounced 1848 as a betrayal of working-class ideals by a bourgeoisie indifferent to the legitimate demands of the proletariat. According to the Oxford Handbook of Karl Marx, Marx used many terms to refer to a post-capitalist society: positive humanism, socialism, communism, realm of free individuality, free association of producers, etc. He used these terms completely interchangeably. The notion that socialism and communism are distinct historical stages is alien to his work and only entered the lexicon of Marxism after his death. According to the Encyclopaedia Britannica, exactly how communism differs from socialism has long been a matter of debate, but the distinction rests largely on the communists' adherence to the revolutionary socialism of Karl Marx.